It's the end of the day with Ray. Hello, my friends. Well, you can see in the Sharp Interactive board, I have a guest. That guest is David Finz, and David Finz works for Alliant Insurance. He works at the Cyber Security Insurance Division. And David, it's great to have you on. How are you doing? I think it's been about 10 months.
Doing great, Ray. Good to see you again, and thanks for having me back on the program.
Well, you know, David, we met in Orlando. We went to a big IT event there recently, and it was a great opportunity for you to put your eyes on a whole bunch of MSPs all at the same time. And, you know, we were sitting there talking, having a beer, I believe it was, and I asked you a question. I said, well, what do you think about the level of maturity around these MSPs that you're talking to regarding cybersecurity insurance? And why don't you share some of your thoughts with the audience here today?
Sure. Well, you know, Ray, having walked through the exhibition hall and speaking to the various MSPs that were there, several of whom we've actually done business with on behalf of our clients, right? I can tell you that the maturity level runs the gamut, right? You know, there were several companies represented there that clearly understand the threat landscape that they're dealing with and know how to protect their customers. And you know, there are others that I spoke to that, quite frankly, look like they were just winging it.
Yeah,
you know, it's a little concerning.
Well, you know, I keep telling my friends, you know, throwing stuff on a website around marketing, you have some consultants in the space that'll tell MSPs, hey, you got to market cybersecurity. You got to market cybersecurity. And I think before they start marketing it, they ought to learn what they're doing. They ought to understand the real risk and the real potential threats to not only their business, but the clients they serve. And I just don't think people pay attention to that enough.
Absolutely. You know, I mean, it's easy to put something on a website and say, oh, in addition to print services, we can help you protect your network as well, right? And anybody can put the right search terms in there and push themselves, to the top of the search results. But to actually repurpose a firm so that they are, become an essential part of a customer's network security infrastructure, that takes some doing. And again, some of the firms clearly get it, and others frankly look like they're making it up as they go along.
Yeah, which is pretty scary in its own right. So David has a podcast and it's on YouTube, and it's called the Cyber Insurance what's the name of your Imperative?
Cyber Insurance Imperative.
Thank you, David. And he puts out these videos. I think you do those weekly or a couple a week. But your last one was on an MSP and some MSP rules, I guess, if you will, in the UK. And I wanted you. Can you just give us a little recap of that episode, because I think this is important, because like you said in your own video, I believe this will get pushed into the U.S. as well. But go ahead and share what you were talking about.
Sure. So what we're seeing happen right now in the UK, and we're watching this carefully because we believe that it may find its way over here as well, is that the government is now going to be putting out regulations that are going to require the disclosure of any significant incidents on the part of the MSP's network that could impact customers, and also establish some minimum security standards for those MSPs to follow. And what's really kind of eye-popping is that non-compliance could result in penalties as high as 17 million pounds.
Wow.
That's, at the current exchange rate, that's about $20 million.
Mm-hmm.
So, based on what we've seen happen in Europe, they tend to be a step ahead of us from the regulatory side, with GDPR, which your listeners may be familiar with. And those regulations are now being, to some extent, imitated here in the States, first by California and several other states as well. I wouldn't be surprised if we saw, some regulatory enforcement in the next, year or two at the state level here, if not at the federal level, that calls these MSPs into account. Because, as I mentioned on the episode that I did, it's easier in some states to get a license to braid hair. Or let me rephrase that. It's tougher to get a license to braid hair than it is to open up shop and claim that you're an MSP and can help clients with cybersecurity.
Yeah, that's pretty scary. That is pretty scary when you think about it. I mean, it's
so we're concerned here because obviously from our standpoint as a broker, we represent in the insurance marketplace many MSPs. We also represent the customers of MSPs and do business with them. So we do see both sides of the equation. And so there are very specific things that MSPs should be doing to shore up their own security, limit their liability with their customers, and also make sure that they have effective insurance in place to cover the losses, the claims that may come in if they do have an incident.
So, a cyber insurance, if you think about it from a company's perspective, if I'm ABC company and I want to get cyber insurance, I pay a fee, I insure my company. But when I'm an MSP and I have multiple accounts, let's say I have 100 customers, how do I insure it? Because if I have a major breach that affects 100 customers, the liability just explodes at that point. It's not just about one little company. It's about 100 companies that could come back on me as the MSP. Can you walk me through what that looks like?
Sure. So most contracts that I've seen for these types of services contain a limitation of liability. And the way it typically works is that the MSP will cap its liability at an amount equal to, say, 1 or 2 years annual fee. Now, why would a customer agree to this? Well, there's exceptions in that limitation of liability clause for acts of intentional wrongdoing or recklessness, gross negligence on the part of the MSP, which of course is harder to prove at trial. Ironically, right, those deliberate misconduct acts are the ones that are going to be excluded if proven under an insurance policy, because obviously the underwriters don't want to cover intentional wrongdoing. That creates what us insurance geeks would call a moral hazard. It almost encourages wrongdoing by making it easy to get out of it. Now, they will defend an MSP that is accused of intentional wrongdoing because any plaintiff can plead anything they want. But they're not, if those allegations are proven at trial and they, hold up on appeal, right, and there's a final adjudication of that against the MSP, those damages resulting from intentional wrongdoing, they're not going to be covered anyway. So, the insurance is designed to pick up the simple negligence that you were unable to deliver the services promised, maybe as a result of your network experiencing an outage and your customers suffering some loss as a result through, just simple inadvertent error or your security not being able to keep out a bad actor and you're being hacked.
So here's a question for you. If I'm an MSP and I have a customer that the impact of a breach that I caused, let's just say that I was negligent as the MSP, whatever that means. Maybe my PSA tool was really the culprit, but it was affected through me and my customers. So, of course, the lawsuits are all going to go upstream as you go. But what if one of those clients had a really big impact, but my fee was relatively small to their impact?
Well, there's always a possibility that a court could strike down one of those provisions as unconscionable, right? It's kind of like the old saying, the little old lady in Topeka doesn't really have a lot of bargaining power against, a giant telecommunications company or internet service provider. So is it really, a fair, level playing field when they're negotiating the agreement? It's harder for a plaintiff to say that the terms are unconscionable if it's a B2B arrangement, right? Because at the end of the day, the customer may have in-house a legal department. They may be able to go outside and hire outside counsel. Nobody's got a gun to their head to agree to these terms. And it's not, as I said, unusual for MSPs to cap their liability in that fashion. But that doesn't rule out the possibility that some judge or jury or even an arbitrator could come and take a look at it and say, you know what, you were making $25,000 a year off of this customer and you caused $10 million in damage. I'm not letting you off the hook that easily, right?
Okay.
There comes a level where that provision might look unconscionable to a judge or arbitrator.
So we're talking about this British law going into effect where we put some regulation on the MSPs. But let's go back here in the United States today. So you represent multiple insurance companies. Your firm's really a brokerage firm. Am I correct in that?
Right. So we trade with multiple insurance companies. We represent the interests of the policyholder in that process.
Okay.
So the business buying the insurance.
So if I'm an MSP today and I seek out to you and say, hey, we want to make sure we have the right cyber insurance, what do you do to make sure that I'm the right MSP without any mandatory regulations?
Right. Well, look, the first step in the process is to help our clients assess the risk that they face, right? We know what types of security controls the underwriters think move the needle, what's most important in their mind for businesses to have in place, including MSPs, right? And, the risk is stating the obvious: multi-factor authentication, endpoint detection and response. Having someone in-house whose designated role is cybersecurity, right? Privilege access management, phishing training for employees. I could go on and on. But the point is to have those controls in place. So we will take a look at the business's industry revenue, how many records they're holding, how many endpoints, how many workstations do they have. We have a subscription to a service that will benchmark them against similar firms to see what kind of limits they might need to withstand the losses that they could face, and will conduct a non-invasive vulnerability scan on their network so that we can see what the bad actors see, right? If it's an attractive target from the outside around the network perimeter, the attack surface, right, that would suggest if there's open ports, if there's things that aren't addressed, if there's chatter about the entity on the dark web, if there's passwords that have been leaked, if they look like they have a target on their back, we're going to want to address those things up front. So we don't go to the market, we don't go to the underwriters with an application until we've identified what they need to make sure they're up to speed. And then and only then, right, do we go to the underwriters and try to minimize the number of conditions they have to meet in order to bind coverage.
So if you're dealing with an MSP, and let's say you go through this process with that MSP, and they're doing all the things that you recommend or you mandate they do, however you do that in your contract, and they stop doing some of those things, or they, their best practices aren't so best anymore. Do they become liable from that aspect too?
Well, when you bind coverage, right, you're making a representation to the underwriters that the statements that you're making in the application are true and correct to the best of your knowledge, right? If you say at that point that you have MFA on, all of your devices and, throughout the network, and it turns out it was a bold-faced lie, right, that's going to be a problem, right? If for some reason a hacker was able to bypass it, and MFA is important, but it's not the be-all and end-all, and there are ways through what they call man-in-the-middle type of threats that bad actors can get around it, that doesn't mean that the statement you made was false, right? But if there's fraud in the application, that's a whole other story, right? Again, our role in the process is to represent the policyholder, or as we call them, the insured. We want them to present themselves to the underwriters in the best possible light. We can help them identify what they need to do that, and connect them, with consultants who can help bring their security up to speed, right? But we're not going to participate in anything that portrays them falsely. So it's up to them at that point to make sure that what they're representing about their security, their cyber maturity is correct, and to maintain it. And for that matter, a lot of the underwriters now are actively taking part in keeping their policyholders up to date. They will, put out alerts and say, hey, there's this critical vulnerability that's just been identified. We want to make sure that your people are on top of this, and they're patching and they're updating and they're doing what they need to do to protect the network. And so ideally it should work as a partnership, and that requires both the underwriters and the policyholder acting in good faith and relying and trusting what the other one is putting forward.
Well, I think a lot of times people set policies, but through leadership changes, sometimes those policies might get tweaked, if you will, and it could go the wrong way. As versus getting more secure, it could go less secure. You get a new leader that doesn't want to do two-factor authentication, as an example. Oh, that's too complicated. I don't want to do that anymore. And so I think it's important that MSPs understand if they write policies, they have to abide by those policies. Let me ask you a question. How many MSPs around the country, just from your experience, do you believe are probably underinsured?
Well, let's start with a basic statistic, right, which has been thrown around for a couple of years now, which is that 7 out of 10 small and mid-sized businesses in America still don't buy cyber insurance.
Okay, that's pretty
And,
good.
many of these MSPs would fall in that category. So I don't have a specific for that industry, right, that sector, but I can tell you that that's a general statistic. Now, why is that? Well, some of that is because they don't believe that they are a legitimate target because they think they're small fish. But I can tell you that, close to, almost 4 out of 10 cyber attacks are launched against businesses with under 100 million a year in revenue. So just because you're small doesn't mean you're not, that you're an unattractive target. In fact, you may be an easier target. Another reason that they don't buy it is because they believe that cyber insurance doesn't pay on the claims. The underwriters would disagree with that. They've been paying on the claims, but the reason that that falsehood is, kind of perpetuated is because people often don't read past the headlines. When there's a coverage dispute with an insurance carrier, more often than not, it's because the policyholder didn't buy cyber insurance and they're trying to wedge their claim under a crime or a property policy that was never really designed for that purpose. And surprise, when they lose in court, people look at that and they say, those doggone insurers, they don't pay claims. Well, yeah, that's an argument for getting dedicated cyber coverage. It's not an argument for not buying it, right? It's because somebody tried to fit a square peg in a round hole, and they not having bought the right coverage, they were trying to get the claim paid under a policy that was never really intended for that. So these are the obstacles that we face in speaking to business owners, right? And whoever makes the decision, whether it's a treasurer, a CFO, or in a larger company, if they have a risk manager, about why cyber insurance should be part of their overall strategy. And buying the insurance itself can serve as a gut check, because you've got to be able to, pass muster with the underwriters. So you need to have the right controls in place that they will be willing to offer you terms. And it actually can incentivize businesses to upgrade their security in order to satisfy those criteria.
Well, here's a question. I'm an MSP. I have a customer. That customer has a cyber insurance policy. And all of a sudden, that customer decides to leave me as the MSP. We're going to go with another company. And that other MSP has a lot more liability, if you will. Maybe their best practices aren't so great, and maybe that's why the customer's leaving, because they wanted something a little less money, a little cheaper. They engage with this new MSP, and they don't notify the insurance company. Do they have to notify their insurance company that there was a change, and how does that affect the policy?
Well, the underwriters are not necessarily looking at every single vendor that is engaged by the insured. That would be an overly burdensome process, and no business would ever get transacted. But they do ask about the practices in place at their insured, at the policyholder level, right? Tell us about the vetting process for your service providers, right? Tell us about the contractual rights and responsibilities that you have, right? What is the process by which you select vendors? And so that does matter. At the end of the day, if there is a loss on the part of one of our clients who's not an MSP, right, because of a lapse in security at the MSP level, right? So in other words, the most common example of that would be there's an outage on the network of the MSP, and as a result of that, my client loses income or incurs extra expense because they can't do business now as a result of the interruption on the MSP's network, right? In that situation, in the first instance, the insurance carrier is going to pay the claim because our client suffered what's known as a dependent business interruption. But then they may have the right to what's called subrogate against the MSP to recover the money that they paid out, because after all, ultimately the fault lays with the MSP. Now, there may be something in the contract that prevents them from doing so, and that could take up a whole other episode where we can talk about policy wording. But the point is that the underwriters are very mindful of the fact that much of the losses that their policyholders see are the result of third-party lapses in cybersecurity. That's sort of baked into the process here in terms of how much limits they offer for that kind of scenario, and also what they can do to recover on those losses once they've paid them out when there's a claim.
Well, David, I don't think MSPs want to be in the insurance business, number one. So what do you recommend they do? So, I mean, they're dealing with prospects all the time. They're trying to grow their business, obviously. So they're doing assessments on the IT infrastructure and all that. There probably should be some kind of an assessment on the insurance piece. But can they engage with a company like yours, if you will, to just help them articulate a conversation? Because I would imagine they want to be out of that. I don't think the MSP wants to have any part of the insurance whatsoever. Here's the relationship with this insurance company kind of thing. But do the insurance companies help MSPs through that process, and is it fee-based? How would that work?
No, absolutely. Look, again, as part of our role as a broker, we want to present our clients in the best possible light. So for starters, if the MSP needs help qualifying for cyber insurance, right, they should absolutely come to us. Mm-hmm. One of the most common reasons we see MSPs approaching us for a quote for cyber insurance is because their customers are beginning to demand evidence of the coverage, right, whether it's $1, $3, or $5 million. And, they want the MSP to be able to certify that they have the coverage. Well, to qualify for it, your cybersecurity's got to be up to a certain level of maturity. That's the first thing. Now, as far as the MSP's customers, really, at that point, if the MSP wants to become, how can I put this, more full service and say, listen, we're going to help you get the best security you can in place, but recognizing that you can never 100% of the time prevent an attack, and you may suffer losses, right? We can refer you to an insurance broker that can help you get coverage, transfer that risk. And again, that's where we would come in and we follow the same process of helping them qualify for the coverage and then negotiating the best terms that we can for them, and then helping them if they do have a claim.
Okay, that's interesting stuff. Well, I think it would be, let me ask you one follow-up on that. So if I'm an MSP and I'm doing an assessment, if you will, of a customer that I want to take on as a client, and part of that assessment, I get a hold of their cyber insurance agreements, and then I could share those cyber insurance agreements with a brokerage house or an expert like yourself, and then you could kind of say, hey, you know what, I would have a concern with this policy based on this. Is that something that you believe that MSP should partake in?
Well, look, again, if they're not insurance brokers, they're not licensed to transact business, they're not going to be placing the coverage, right? If as part of their assessment they ask customers whether they have the insurance, right? I'll be more than happy to take a look at the policy and make sure it's, as we call it, fit for purpose.
Sure.
I know that you have, quipped sometimes that, free advice, isn't worth what you pay for it. I totally get that, but in order for me to begin a conversation with a potential client, I have to at least know what they have in place and whether there's room for improvement on it, right? So, that's a process that we're happy to do for prospective clients of ours. And at that point, in order for a broker to approach the underwriters on behalf of that company, they need what's called a broker of record letter. So if that business is already represented in the marketplace by another insurance broker, I'll be happy to look at their policy, but we can't begin to act on their behalf until they decide, right? If they have coverage in place. If they don't have cyber insurance coverage in place, then of course we can approach them. But again, if they have a broker of record already, then that precludes our going to the market on their behalf unless and until they appoint us. But the conversation has to begin somewhere, and reviewing their policy to make sure that it does what they intend for it to do is the first step.
Well, and we all know that everybody needs cyber insurance. I mean, what are we doing? Why are we not doing this? It's crazy. Hopefully the regulations, maybe that makes us all do it. But at the end of the day, it's a big risk not to be taken care of. And David, is there anything you want to add before we end?
No, just wanted to say, here at Alliant, we are all about helping our clients find a more rewarding way to manage risk. And, cyber insurance is a big part of that. People can reach out to me on LinkedIn, or they can email me at david.finz, F-I-N-Z, @alliant.com. And Ray, I hope you don't mind my putting in a plug for the blog and podcast. I release a new episode pretty much every Sunday evening, and you can find me on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts.
Hey, put that in the comments when I post today's video. No problem. The link to your
podcast.
David, it's great talking to you because everybody watching me knows this. Status quo is the killer of all that'll be invented. Don't get stuck in status quo, and I'll see you all tomorrow.